Okay, what I want to talk about today is something called the Persian Wars. And I've given you dates here from 492 to 479 BC. Now, as you'll see, some things are actually happening before this date. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the setup of these wars and then what happened. And then next week, we'll look at sort of the aftermath of this war. So, of course, we're talking about the Persian Wars, which means we're really talking about Persia. And Persia was a fairly massive area that was under the control of a number of different civilizations before the Persians took over. So, not important to memorize this, but you've got the kingdom of Assyria, that was taken over by the Medes, and then you've got the Persians taking over the area that the Medes controlled. And here's just kind of a pretty terrible map showing you a bit of the extent of Persia. So this is modern day Turkey here, Asia Minor, goes all the way back into modern day Iran, and then pushing towards India. So again, a very large kingdom that was under the control. Now, we're not going to spend too much time looking at this, but the Persian government was very different. And what you're looking at here is a frieze showing the Persian king sitting on his throne. And like a lot of iconography, royal iconography, the people who are not royals are actually shorter. You can see that here. What you have here is people lining up to give presents or pay their taxes to the king. And I put here that, it is different from the Greek form of government because early on in Greek history, you did have kings, and we talked about that, but that was, they were all removed later. And then you either had tyrants or you had a form of democracy. So they had very elaborate ceremonies. People who were seeking an audience with the king, the Persian king, would sometimes have to kneel or even lay flat on the ground to show their obedience to the king. Now, in 599, you have a very famous Persian named Cyrus, and later he's called Cyrus the Great. You can read about him even in the Old Testament. He's mentioned. The Medes fell to the Persians in 550. Now, I'll show you a map in just a bit of this area, a close-up map. But you do have another kingdom that is lying a little bit west of the Persian Empire called the Kingdom of Lydia. And that was ruled by a man named Croesus. And in 560, what happened is Croesus took control of Lydia, and that gave him control of an area called Ionia. And we talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago, about how a number of Greeks migrated to Asia Minor and the coast along the Aegean Sea, and that's Ionia. So you've got quite a few Greek city-states in that area, and this is where Croesus comes in, takes them over, and they go under his control. Now, Croesus was massively wealthy. According to Herodotus, a Greek historian, he really liked all Greek things. So we know that Croesus sent representatives to the Delphic oracle because Croesus was, I just said, very wealthy, very ambitious, and he wanted to take over the Persian kingdom because with all of these things happening within the Persian kingdom, this was a good time to try and take it over. If you notice, I say that the Medes fell to the Persians in 550. In 546 BC, just 4 years later, Croesus tries to take over the Persian Empire. And he goes to the Delphic oracle and he gets the words, if you attack, you will destroy a great kingdom. So Croesus thinks, great, the great kingdom that's going to fall is Persia. And that was not the case. So he attacked the Persians and the Persians attacked him and took it over. What this really means for Greek history is that with Croesus being defeated, the Persians take over Ionia. And this is when a lot of these Greek city-states come under the control of Cyrus the Great and the Persians. And this is a map showing some of the city-states during the area of colonization. So a little bit later, it's a little different, but for the most part, these city-states are the same. Now, the Persians, when they took over land, they did not force their own type of government, language, and so on the people they conquered. What they did was they allowed them to keep very similar governments as long as they pledged their allegiance to the Persian king. So a lot of the Greek city-states could retain, if they had a form of democracy, they could retain that. if they had a tyrant or if they had um, an oligarchy, they were allowed to keep all that. Now, Cyrus passes away in 430, and his son Cambyses takes control from 530 to 552. Now, as I put here, Cambyses died because the Persians were really expanding their empire, and they expanded into Persia, which they captured at this point. And he died when he had heard that there was a coup happening in Persia. So he left Egypt and he died on the way. Now, a man named Darius takes over, and there's a lot of interesting history around Darius because he doesn't seem to be part of the royal family, but he writes himself into the royal family. Regardless, Darius becomes the king of Persia. And during this time period, Darius decides he's going to invade even further. So I'm hoping you can see my highlighter. He goes up through Macedonia and goes into an area called Scythia. Now the Scythians were pretty smart. As Darius was chasing after them, they kept going further and further north. And so Darius decides it's too far north, there's not enough support for his troops, and so he backs out and stops trying to capture the Scythians. Now, what happens though is that Darius takes control of Macedonia. You can see here on this map, it becomes part of his kingdom as what they're called satrapies or provinces. So this is the first time you've got a Persian king sort of moving into what we would call Europe. Now, what happens soon after this is that the Ionians revolt. And it's partly over taxes. So Darius was raising taxes to fund his various expansions. And a lot of the Ionian city-states revolts against him. And part of this revolt starts with a man named Aristogoras. He was a tyrant in a city called Miletus. And he wanted to control another area close to him. And what he did was he asked the Persians to help him. That didn't go so well. And as the Greek city-states are rising up against Persia, Aristogoras decides he's going to take advantage of this. And instead of asking Persians for help, he turns against them. So he leads a rebellion against the Persians. Now, Aristogoras travels and sends people to Greece, asking for their help. And the Spartans refused to. They said it's too far away. Apparently it was a 3-month journey to get to this area and overland, and they decided not to do it. But Athens decides to help. So Athens sends ships and men to this area, and they attack a city called Sardis, which is really the capital of this area. The Persians, in return, attacked Miletus, and what they ended up doing is selling the population into slavery and moving their own people into this area. And a lot of those people were Greeks that they ended up selling into slavery. Now, at the same time, Sardis was burned to the ground. So the Persians were not very happy about this. And of course, they knew that the Athenians and the Greeks were involved in this. Now, moving back into Athens, so while this is all happening, you have a man named Themistocles. And he was an archon or ruler, an elected ruler in 593 and 592. And he wanted Athens to start building up its defenses because he was really worried about the fact that Athens was involved in trying to help Aristogoras take over the Persians. And so he wanted to build a massive navy. What he ended up doing first is rebuilding and fortifying an area called the Piraeus. And that's at the, Athens is sort of inland. As you go west, you hit the Aegean Sea, and that's where the Piraeus is. So he started to rebuild that and fortify that port of Athens because it was a really important area for the Athenians, especially with all the trade coming in. You also have a man getting involved in this sort of buildup called Miltiades. He was a tyrant of Thrace. That's an area that the Persians ended up taking over as well. And later he becomes the general of Athens when the fighting really starts. Now, Darius decides he's going to punish Greece. And what he ends up doing is in 491, he sends out envoys to ask for submission. And Athens, Sparta, and an area called Eritrea, they refused to submit to the Persians. And so what Darius decided to do is invade. And he got his son-in-law Mardonius. They built up a navy and sent troops. And I'll show you a map here in just a bit. Now, I just mentioned that Athens, Sparta, and Eritrea refused to submit. Many Greek city-states did submit, and I'll show you a map of that in just a bit. And then moving back, so if you remember, I talked about Pisistratus and his sons Hippias and Hipparchus. Remember, Hipparchus was assassinated. Hippias was driven out, and he went to Persia. Hippias makes a return here, and more than likely, Hippias is helping the Persians plan out how to take Athens. He was on one of these ships that's sent over to take over Athens. Now, what you're looking at this map are actually three different things. Ignore the light black line. I'll talk about that in just a second. So what you've got here is the route that the Navy took. Now, you've got troops on ground that Mardonius is leading. You've got this line here. Now, this is where his ships came. Now, this area where it says Mount Athos is a very dangerous spot for ships. And many of his ships were destroyed in a storm. And he ends up sailing back into Persian territory. And so what Darius ends up doing is deciding that he was going to send a navy the southern route. And this is what this other red line is. Okay, and you've got, I just mentioned Miltiades. He became a general in this battle. And one of the more famous battles in history was the battle at Marathon, which is a Greek city-state. So I just mentioned that Darius decides to send his ships over. They land at Marathon, and they are overwhelming numbers. Now, we have to be careful because a lot of what we know from about this particular battle is coming from Greek writers. Herodotus says, they were vastly outnumbered by the Persians, and the Greeks probably were. But at Marathon, the Greeks kind of surprisingly defeated the Persians. And this was done by the Greeks sort of running down this hill, leaving a large number of their troops on the side. So they had like sorry, I can't see my hands, a pincher motion where there were some troops going down the middle and the most of them were coming on the sides. Now that area was fairly swampy too. And as the Persians started to retreat, a lot of them got stuck in the marshes and were killed that way. So the Battle of Marathon was won by the Greeks. They defeated the Persians in this first part of the war. Now, what Athens ended up doing is attacking a lot of the Greek city-states that went to the Persian side as punishment. Now, warning signals started to build up in Persia that the Athenians knew about. So Darius decides to raise taxes in 486, and they thought this was an indication that he is getting ready to invade again. So Themistocles sent an envoy to the Delphic oracle, and the oracle said, rely on your wooden walls. Now, there was a lot of debate in Athens about what exactly that meant. Lots of people thought that meant building up the fortifications around Athens, obviously using wood. Now, Themistocles said, I don't think that's what it means. I think it means build up our navy. Use those as a wall against the Persians. And at the same time, you get this massive find of silver that the Athenians had control of. And what they ended up doing is following the advice of Themistocles and building up this massive navy. I have one interesting Greek word here. So strategoi, these are generals. And this is where we get the word strategy from. So Themistocles was strategos in 483, and this is when he really started building up these triremes. Now, these ships or triremes are 3 levels, so that's what the tri is, 3 levels of oars. And you've got 170 rowers, just 10 soldiers and 10 archers. So 170 rowers to move the ship and just 20 military people on it. These ships were very long and narrow. As opposed to the design of ships before, which were fairly wide and not as long. Now, the triremes were very useful for ramming. So what they did was they put a metal piece on the head of the ship, and they rode fast and then rammed into enemy ships, and then the soldiers could climb onto the ships. We'll find out this is a pretty useful thing when you're fighting much larger ships that can't move around as well. Knowing that something was probably up, the Greeks decided to put together another league called the Hellenic League. And this included 31 polis, or 31 city-states. And this was put under the control of the Spartans. So you've got Leonidas, the king of Sparta. He controlled the land forces, and you have Eurybiades, who controlled the sea. Now, as before, when Darius was about to enter, many of the Greek city-states didn't join because they were convinced that the Persians were going to win if they were going to invade again. And so you've got a lot of internal discussion, internal disputes about who was going to join this Hellenic League to defend Greece against a possible invasion again, and who isn't. Now, Darius dies, and his son Xerxes takes control. Xerxes decides that he is going to invade Greece again. And what you've got here, again, I hope you can see my highlighter, is this line. And this is the route that Xerxes takes. Now, he also has a navy following him. And if you remember, Mardonius had lots of trouble at this Mount Athos area. What the Persians ended up doing is digging a canal. So bypassing the most dangerous spot in terms of storms and waves and so on, so that they could get their troops to follow, so they get their navy to follow along with the troops. And I've got three actually red circles on here. These are areas that were controlled by the Persians. So Macedonia was a Persian satrapy or Persian province. Thessaly, the northern part of Greece, went over to the Persians. And then you've got an area called Boeotia. They also were allied with the Persians. So you can see that this looks really bad for the Greeks. So as the Persians are coming along, there is a sort of a narrow area that troops would have to go through at a city-state called Thermopylae. And this is probably one of the more famous battles in ancient history, again, just like the Battle of Marathon. It's called the Battle of Thermopylae. And if you've watched the movie 300, this is a very famous scene in the movie where you've got the Spartan king Leonidas and his 300 Spartans who stayed in this little neck of area that had the sea on one side, cliffs on another, this very narrow area, to try and stop the Persians. Now, he fought and then ended up dying in this area. And there's a plaque there that says, "Go tell the Spartans, O passerby, that here we lie, complying with our orders." And the order was to stay and fight to the death. And that's exactly what they did. Now, I don't know if this is going to show up on your slide. I'll give you the link to the battle scene from the movie 300 if you want to watch that. Now, as the Persians, so they defeated the Spartans at Thermopylae, they continue on, and they make it all the way to Athens. Now, just before the Persians get to Athens, the Athenians, instead of staying and fighting, decide that they're going to evacuate. And so what they do is they go out into the nearby islands, and they stay there in hopes that the gods will oversee Athens and protect it. Now, what the Persians did is they invaded the city-state of Athens. They went up onto the Acropolis and destroyed quite a few of the buildings that were up there that Pisistratus ended up building. So the Acropolis in Athens was destroyed, and we know that people on these islands could see the burning of their city. Now, Themistocles, who was the general, ended up tricking Xerxes. So he sent a message to Xerxes and said, "Hey, things are looking bad. You can win this battle by bringing your ships into the area by the Piraeus in Athens, because that's our last holdout, and you can take it over." So Xerxes jumped on this, brought these very large naval ships into this area, and Themistocles unleashed the triremes on them. And so again, the triremes were very narrow, long, and had a metal point at the end, so they could ram the Persian ships. And they lost a huge number of ships, and the Persians were defeated again. So pretty amazing stuff. Again, we're not really looking at military history too much, but the Greeks, being very small, defeated the very large Persian Empire. Now, Xerxes left. He was very mad. He killed a bunch of his generals for not being able to take this area. He went home. He left Mardonius in the north and in Thessaly. And I mentioned that Thessaly was part of Persian, an area that Persia controlled. So just a year later, 479 BC, Mardonius invades Athens again. The Athenians retreat, leave their city. The Acropolis was burned once again. However, the Greeks in the Hellenic League got together. They had a battle at Plataea, and I'm hoping you can see it on this map. It's right here, Plataea. This is where Mardonius is killed in the battle. And what happens is the Persians get on their fleet, and then they flee home. And then you have a naval battle taking place just outside this Greek city-state called Mycale, and this red arrow points right to it in 479. And this is when the Persians were defeated. Now, and then what you have is a bunch of the city-states in Ionia rebelling against the Persians because they've been kicked out of Greece. I will tell you that the Persians never again try to invade Greece, but what we'll see over and over again is that the Greeks, even though they just defeated the Persians in this war to save Greece, ask the Persians for money and want their influence later on. And what we're going to talk about next time is some of the aftermath of the Persian Wars and how this really tore apart Greece.